After my recent video discussing the aliens that changed Ben 10, where I covered the aliens that followed the original 10 in the classic series, I thought it was about time that we get into the aliens that really shook up the series, and more or less replaced the original 10 as far as early and Alien Force is concerned. So, following the enormous success that was the original Ben 10 series, Cartoon Network ordered a continuation. Though that follow-up series had less direct involvement from the team over at Man of Action, who were focusing their attention on Generator Rex at the time. So the follow-up series Alien Force, as I'm sure you're well aware, set a darker, more mature tone for the following adventures of a now much older Ben. And with that came an art style change and, more relevant to this conversation, a new roster of aliens that changed not only what Ben could transform into, but also the complexity that went into designing each of those alien transformations, along with their power sets. So going into this, we'll be covering each of the initial 10 new transformations that appeared in whatever order, then doing a bit of a bonus round touching on each of the later additions to the series. But before we do, I want to take you back to September 2008. I'm sitting in the pool house of my friend's parents' place, absolutely glued to the screen when Alien Force first aired. The hype that Cartoon Network built around the series premiere was palpable. I'd seen ad after ad, and I'd been waiting for what felt like forever for a follow-up after the original series ended, and sitting there with my best mate at primary school age, mind you, pre the internet being as accessible as it is now, felt like the event of the century. And we were certainly the target demographic at the time. I remember being so excited about the aged-up characters and the darker tone. Looking back at it now, I think I look at the classic series slightly more fondly, but do appreciate what went to Alien Force. Before we move on to the alien transformations themselves, there's a few fantastic videos by friends of the channel Dan Boy Wonder and Kuro over at the Ink Tank surrounding the early development stages of Alien Force. I'll link both of those videos in the description if you're eager to take a deeper dive into Alien Force more generally outside of the new roster of aliens. But for now, let's discuss some of the earlier goings-on that went into establishing this new roster of aliens. As I'm sure you can imagine, and something I've always just assumed before looking into it, Swampfire's inspiration came from both Wildvine and Heat Blast, being this roster's standard for Heat Blast in that staple way Alien Force tends to create counterparts to previous aliens who fill the same role as their predecessors, only in new and interesting ways, with these new aliens typically being more complex than their previous versions. Swampfire in particular went through quite a few different looks before settling on the one we see in series. I'm particularly fond of the more Creature from the Black Lagoon look done by Eric Ganate. As far as in-series, Swampfire was an immediate hit. I so distinctly remember the first time seeing him and being blown away by the idea of a plant alien who can control flames. There's something in that with how cohesive the Alien Force playlist is, while generally being more complex both in design and power set than the original series roster, while not feeling so bogged down in too many abilities. Really setting a great example that the following aliens on this list kept going. Then we've got Echo Echo, who more or less looks pretty in line with his earlier looks. Again, with the idea of adding more and more complex abilities and combinations of abilities, Echo Echo gets what feels like a supercharged version of Blitzwolfer or Ben Wolfer's Sonic Howl, while also getting all the upsides of Ditto's self-duplication ability without any of the setbacks like with the shared pain, though I'm pretty confident there are crew statements saying that Blitzwolfer's Howl is more powerful than Echo Echo, but Echo Echo's feels more powerful in series. The combination of those two abilities being Echo Echo's niche. There's also this once-off ability we see from Ben as Echo Echo to duplicate himself then return to human, having each of those duplicates now be able to transform into other transformations or do whatever else really, though this also splits up his personality amongst them, making them all fragments of himself. There's something so fantastic about the simplicity of this design. I personally kind of prefer the appearance come omniverse, but in either series they've added just enough elements to make him work, while also having sort of a stripped down feel with his pretty much monochromatic design, and very much appropriate for the era and something I found out researching for this video. Echo Echo's design was based off an iPod, or at least the 2008 sort of era iPod. Beyond that, there was a theory that he was living sound in a containment suit, which was initially dismissed by creators before later being reaffirmed by Derek J. Wyatt that said this was indeed the case. While, like the others, the original look for Spider-Monkey was distinctly more alien-looking, most of them weren't all that dissimilar from what we ended up seeing in series. He's never been my absolute favourite alien, but I tend to enjoy his involvement in the series. Despite my slight preference, he is one of Man of Action's favourite transformations. And I think you can really feel that in series. There's a certain level of care that went into the scenes with Spider-Monkey involved. Not all that relevant to Alien Force, but his ultimate form come Ultimate Alien was one of my favourite ultimates besides from the big two. I think what ended up winning me over to this design, other than the power set, was the extra limbs, really setting himself apart from that much more human shape a lot of the Alien Force roster has. As far as powers and abilities go, he's kind of a Spider-Man stand-in. He's got webbing and enhanced strength that varies wildly, but generally feels really strong and surprisingly durable. That might also just be in contrast to his much smaller size than any of the other strong guys. Now before we move on to my favourite of the bunch, if you're enjoying this video or like the style of content, please subscribe. If you already are, great, we'll get back into it. Now for my absolute favourite alien, not just on this list, but series-wide, even if Omniverse took him in a very different direction. There's something so sleek about Big Chill, a sleekness that was present in pretty much every iteration of his earlier designs as well. He's this quiet, slender Mothman who in such a creative way drapes his wings around him using them as a cloak. That along with the tandem abilities to be intangible and have ice abilities, making him another shining example of tossing together two aliens like Ghost Freak and Arctiguana. There are so many standout moments to this one, but one that's probably not talked about enough is the Ben 10 Generator Rex crossover, where Ben as Big Chill steps out of the containment device they've got him in. It might be a bit early in this video to make this call, and I'd be curious what your thoughts are on this, but Big Chill alongside Swampfire and Humungousaur sort of feel like the big three of Alien Force. Though another big one, and one I've talked about briefly a number of times now, but I'll talk about them more generally today, we've got Alien X. And if you're after how powerful this transformation is, or Celestial Sapiens more generally, I've got something in the works that you may enjoy. And a huge credit to the showrunners, designing a pretty much all-powerful omnipotent being must have been a Herculean task. Some of the earlier designs are pretty great, they feel very Justice League inspired to me. I quite like the idea of how multiple personalities within Alien X are conveyed through the various designs with a face on both the front and back of their head. The introduction of Alien X was a major shake-up to the series. It managed to somehow overshadow aliens like Waybig by an immeasurable amount. It also puts a lot of weight on both Ben and the rider's shoulders. I touched on it pretty recently, but the introduction of Alien X brings the weight of functionally losing yourself to the transformation in exchange for infinite power. Alien X both exists outside of time and space while being able to warp both of these properties to his will. I'm sure you already know, but just in case, Alien X has two distinct personalities that are at a constant standstill, being pretty much unable to act without any tiebreaker, making Ben the ideal middleman. At least as far as Alien Force is concerned, he only appears once, and that's probably enough. From that point on, there's a lingering thought in the back of your mind that this transformation is available if anything crops up that's so dire, like with the Annihilar going off come Omniverse. As far as his in-series look, I quite like it. A bit of an Echo but reversed and taken to the extreme, his form is so simple but balanced out with those stars all over his body. Brainstorm definitely had a pretty major change between earlier sketches and his Omniverse design. I was never that much of a fan of him design-wise, but just about everything I wasn't all that keen on changed come Omniverse. The way he sort of looks like he's always leaning forwards, the length of his torso and roundness of his head were never my thing, though I did quite like his overall look more when he uses his powers and his head opens up. Speaking of, he also managed to fill two roles, kind of being grey matter and somewhat Buzzshock, but so does Frankenstrike in the classic series. Though Brainstorm goes about using these powers in a way that feels very distinct, this species' intelligence is more comparable to grey matter's, and he's much more capable in most combat situations, both with his control over electricity and his surprising amount of strength. While different, each of Chromastone's earlier looks all feel well within what you'd picture if I were to describe Chromastone's look to you, and you had to sketch him out without knowing exactly what he looked like prior. This transformation, at least aesthetically, sort of slots in perfectly for Diamond Head, being a derivative of the same species. Though ability-wise, he's much closer to a transformation like Feedback than he is Diamond Head. He's not a bruiser, he absorbs and redistributes energy. And that rainbow-coloured sort of kaleidoscope-looking energy is such a fun change from the more standard green energy we see from other sources. Otherwise, Chromastone's stated to have all sorts of powers and abilities that Ben just isn't aware of and hasn't accessed yet. There's a real uniqueness to this transformation. Moving on, as far as Jetray's early designs go, they vary pretty drastically from the in-series look, but I just adore this one in particular. It looks much more like a manta ray. Probably my second favourite concept looking at them behind Swampfire. In series, Jetray has grown on me over the years. He's got a great silhouette, and his Neuroshock blasts work nicely with his flight. I suppose he's the speedster for the Alien Force roster. If you're clasping at straws, you could sort of say he's an in-between of Accelerate and Stinkfly's abilities, not outright replacing either of them and not having the abilities of both totally, but sitting somewhere in between them. He received a lot of love and an enormous amount of screen time in the Ultimate Alien Force era, and as I've talked about a number of times, didn't end up making it into Omniverse alongside Spitter and Fast Track. Moving on, we've got Goop, who is just a great alien. His power set is so distinct while feeling right at home amongst all the other liquid aliens like the Linopens, Gluto species, or that purple alien we see in Ken 10, who looks a lot more like the concept art of Goop more than his final design does. The projector element of this transformation has always been a standout element for me. Having the Omnitrix provide equipment for aliens to function in whatever environment was a great idea. Having an alien entirely made up of liquid needing a gravity projector is so much fun. And that later addition of flight was a logical escalation for what Ben could do with him, making me think what else could Ben work out to do with Goop or even other alien transformations that we haven't seen yet. Next up, we've got Humungousaur, who is the shiny example of the big strong guy archetype that Ben along with myself really enjoy. I've got a whole video dedicated to the highs and lows of this transformation, so I'll keep it relatively brief. But he's got some pretty high highs, and I don't want to outright say low lows, but after Alien Force, loses a lot of what makes him him, including his signature ability to grow. Ability-wise, and following the pattern of this video, he feels like the perfect middle ground between forearms and way big, both in size and feel. He's less of a fighter and more of a tank compared to transformations like forearms, and even when he uses his growth ability, while he feels like an absolute monster, he doesn't quite step on the toes of the weight that comes along with way big. I've not been doing it consistent with every transformation on this list, but if you're after a prime Humungousaur, for example, I highly recommend going back and watching the Alien Force episode, Above and Beyond, where Ben goes up against the Plumber's Helpers. As far as later additions in the series, we've got the introduction of Lodestar and Wrath. Lodestar set themselves apart with a very unique power set controlling magnetism, and even with that uniqueness, visually feels right at home amongst the others in this really cohesive way, unlike the way the additional aliens in the classic series feel more removed from the original 10. Then there's Wrath, who kind of feels slightly more removed. His proportions feel a bit more uniform with a slightly simpler appearance that almost feels more in line with the classic series, minus the clothes and the obvious art style. Him being set apart from the others with his very distinct personality and the influence this species' DNA has over Ben. Altogether, they're a fantastic lot of aliens. I don't know if I have quite as much sentimentality to them as I do the latter additions to the classic, but each of them represent the ongoing growth the series went through. If you have any thoughts or feelings on anything I've said to this point, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, if you've made it this far into the video and aren't subscribed, please consider doing so. Either way, I just appreciate you being here. Thanks for watching.